Hello everyone. In today's segment, we are going to discuss the two important topics. These are classification of psychological disorders and factors underlying abnormal behavior. Actually, from the previous segments, you have got the idea that what is meant by psychological disorder and what are the historical backgrounds related to the psychological disorder. So, it is very important to understand psychological disorders in a very detailed manner, and if we want to understand these disorders, we need to begin by classifying them. So a classification of such disorders consists of a list of categories of specific psychological disorders grouped into various classes on the basis of some shared characteristics. Actually, there are several types of psychological disorders, and all these disorders have different characteristics and all they have different names. So because of the names, we are able to understand the types of psychological disorders. In that sense, classifications are useful because they enable users like psychologists, psychiatrists and social workers to communicate with each other about the disorder and help in understanding the causes of psychological disorders and the processes involved in their development and the maintenance. Actually, all these mental health professionals, they deal with the mental health problems of the people, and they also diagnose the problems of the people by using several tools and techniques, and they need some names actually, and without the name and the characteristics of these disorders, it is not possible for the mental health professionals to diagnose the problems, to solve the problems of the people. So classifications in that sense are useful. Actually, there are two schemes that are basically used to classify psychological disorders. One is Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorder, and another one is International Classification of Diseases. So first is known as the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorder. Now this is published actually by the American Psychiatric Association, that is APA. So APA has published an official manual describing and classifying various kinds of psychological disorder. Now the current version is known as DSM-5. So today psychologists like to use the 5th edition, and this 5th edition is the 2013 update to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the taxonomic and diagnostic tool published by APA. It is American Psychiatric Association. কিন্তু তোমালোকৰ কিছুমানৰ বুকত DSM-4 কথা মেনশ্যন কৰা হৈছে. Now DSM-4 actually evaluates the patient on 5 axes or dimensions rather than just one broad aspect of mental disorder. So these dimensions relate to biological, psychological, social and other aspects. But there is a difference between DSM-4 and DSM-5. Today psychologists actually like to use DSM-5, and it is the revised edition actually. Now in the DSM-4, patients only needed one symptom present to be diagnosed with substance abuse, while the DSM-5 requires 2 or more symptoms in order to be diagnosed with substance use disorder. So the DSM-5 eliminated the psychological subtype and the diagnosis of polysubstance dependence. Then another scheme is known as the International Classification of Diseases, and this classification scheme officially used in India and elsewhere in the 10th edition actually, that is known as ICD-10, which is known as the Classification of Behavioral and Mental Disorders, ICD-10 Classification of Behavioral and Mental Disorders. Now it is a globally used diagnostic tool for epidemiology, health management and clinical purpose. The ICD is maintained by the World Health Organization, which is the directing and coordinating authority for health within the United Nations system. Now there is a difference between DSM and ICD. So the ICD is produced by a global health agency with a constitutional public health mission, while the DSM is produced by a single national professional association. WHO's primary focus for the mental and behavioral disorders classification is to help countries to reduce the disease burden of mental disorders. Actually, DSM খন কি কৰিছে American Psychiatric Association এ পাবলিশ কৰিছে and ICD, that is International Classification of Diseases খন World Health Organization এ প্ৰিপেয়াৰ কৰিছে. সো সেইকাৰণে ডিফাৰেন্স দুইটাতে আছে, কিন্তু আজিকালি কিছুমান সাইকিয়াট্ৰিষ্ট বা সাইকোলজিষ্টে DSM ইউজ কৰে, কিন্তু বেচিক্যালি ইণ্ডিয়ান সাইকিয়াট্ৰিষ্ট বা ইণ্ডিয়ান মেণ্টেল হেল্থ প্ৰফেশ্যনেলে ICD-টোৰ ওপৰত ডিপেণ্ড কৰে, কিন্তু আজিকালি দুইখন স্কিমেই সমানেই মানুহে ব্যৱহাৰ কৰে, মেণ্টেল হেল্থ প্ৰফেশ্যনেলে একচুৱেলি ইউজ কৰে. So the next topic, that is known as factors underlying abnormal behavior. Actually, abnormal behaviors are very complex behaviors, and it is very difficult to understand these complex behaviors. It is very difficult to distinguish abnormal and normal behaviors. So psychologists, they try to understand all these behaviors and they try to distinguish these behaviors, and they use different approaches. Each approach in use today emphasizes a different aspect of human behavior and explains and treats abnormality in line with that aspect. Now, these approaches also emphasize the role of different factors such as biological factors, psychological factors, and interpersonal factors and sociocultural factors. And we will discuss all these factors one by one in a very detailed manner. And psychologists actually, they use all these factors and all these approaches to explain the types of abnormal behaviors. Now, first is the biological factors. So according to some psychologists, to emphasize on biological factors, they state that biological factors are mainly responsible for our abnormal behaviors. So biological factors influence all aspects of our behavior. A wide range of biological factors such as faulty genes, endocrine imbalances, malnutrition, injuries and other conditions may interfere with normal development and functioning of the human body. Actually, ki hoy, faulty genes are responsible for the maladaptive behavior. If faulty genes are transmitted from the parents to progeny, then definitely these children may develop some kinds of abnormal behaviors. Then malnutrition also is another factor associated with abnormal behavior. Jibilak individual proper nutritious food napai, hibilakor karone individual beleg dhoroner mental health problems hobo pare. So this is one biological factor. Then endocrine imbalance is also another important factor. Actually, যদি endocrine systemত বহুত বেলেগ ধৰণৰ hormones actually secrete কৰে endocrine system and all these hormonal secretions, if are not proper, if there is any imbalance, then definitely people may develop several kinds of psychological illnesses. Like pituitary gland secretes some hormones. If there is any disturbance or any imbalances, then definitely people may develop some kinds of mental health problems. And injuries and other conditions also play important role in developing abnormal behaviors. Like kiba accident hole manhe kitiaba brain damage jodi hoy ba kiba problem hoy tete hole manhor memory failure hobo pare ba jikuno dhoroner psychological issues develop hobo pare. Gotike these factors influence us in developing our psychological problems, and these factors may be potential causes of abnormal behavior. So biological factors influence all aspects of our behavior actually, and they interfere with normal development and functioning, are potential causes of abnormal behavior. So psychologists actually biological model or emphasize কৰিছে, and according to the biological model, abnormal behavior has a biochemical or physiological basis. So biological researchers, they have found that psychological disorders are often related to problems in the transmission of messages from one neuron to another neuron. So if there is any disorders in any area of the brain, or if the transmission of messages if are not proper, then people may develop some kinds of psychological problems. Studies indicate that abnormal activity by certain neurotransmitters can lead to specific psychological disorders. Anxiety disorders have been linked to low activity of the neurotransmitter gamma aminobutyric acid, and schizophrenia to excess activity of dopamine, and depression to low activity of serotonin, and so on. So all these are related to the chemical substances. So this picture shows the dopamine. Dopamine actually, it is one chemical substances or chemicals, and if there is any disorder in these chemical substances, then people may develop some kinds of mental health problems. Like schizophrenia is related to the excess activity of dopamine. So genetic factors have been linked to mental disorders, several kinds of mental disorders like mood disorders, schizophrenia, then mental retardation problem, and other kinds of psychological disorders. But researchers have not, however, been able to identify the specific gene that are the culprits. It appears that in most cases, no single gene is responsible for a particular behavior or a psychological disorder. In fact, many genes combine to help bring about our various behaviors and emotional reactions, both functional and dysfunctional. Actually, one particular gene is not responsible for developing a psychological problems. There are several genes, and if there is any dysfunctions actually in any area of these parts, then people may develop some kinds of maladaptive behaviors. Although there is sound evidence to believe that genetic and biochemical factors are involved in mental disorders as diverse as schizophrenia, depression, anxiety, and so on, and biology alone cannot account for most mental disorders. And hence psychologists, they have emphasized on other factors also. So the second important factor is known as the psychological and interpersonal factors. This model states that psychological factors are responsible for our mental health problems, and this model maintained that psychological and interpersonal factors play a significant role to play in abnormal behavior. So these factors include maternal deprivation, and it may be separation from the mother or lack of warmth and stimulation during early years of life, then faulty parent-child relationships such as rejection, overprotection, overpermissiveness, faulty discipline, and so on, then maladaptive family patterns like inadequate family, disturbed family, pathogenic family, and so on, and severe stress. So these are some psychological factors. Actually, maternal deprivation is one important psychological factor. If the child is separated from the mother during the early period, then definitely the children may develop some kinds of psychological problems. And lack of adequate mothering at home also is another important psychological factor. Then early faulty parent-child relationship is another important psychological factor. If the child feels rejected, then because of the rejection also they may develop some kinds of psychological illnesses. If the child is overprotected, then also they may develop some kinds of maladaptive behavior. And over permissiveness also is not good. Over permissiveness also sometimes affect in child's development. And faulty discipline is another important psychological factor. So faulty discipline যদি থাকে তেতিয়াহ'লে সেইটো ফেমিলিত ল'ৰা ছোৱালীবিলাকে কি কৰে, কিছুমান ভুল কাম শিকে বা ভুল কাম কৰে, আৰু এই ফল্টি ডিচিপ্লিনৰ কাৰণে কেতিয়াবা ল'ৰা ছোৱালীবিলাকে সাইকোলজিকেল প্ৰবলেমছ ডেভেলপ কৰিব পাৰে। আৰু কেতিয়াবা কিছুমান ফেমিলি ষ্ট্ৰাকচাৰো মেলাডাপ্টিভ হয়। চ' ইনএডিকুৱেট যদি ফেমিলি হয়, ডিষ্টাৰ্বড ফেমিলি হয়, বা এনি কাইণ্ডছ অফ এণ্টি ছ'চিয়েল ফেমিলি, চ' অল দিছ ফেমিলি ষ্ট্ৰাকচাৰ্ছ অলছ' are responsible for developing several kinds of maladaptive behavior. Now, severe stress. So, stressful situationতো সব মানুহে ভালকৈ নিজকে মেনেজ কৰিব নোৱাৰে, ষ্ট্ৰেছফুল চিটুৱেশ্যনছবিলাক ভালকৈ হেণ্ডেল কৰিব নোৱাৰে। চ' চিভিয়াৰ ষ্ট্ৰেছত মানুহে একচুৱেলি ডিচিশ্যনছ ভালকৈ ল'ব নোৱাৰে বা তেওঁলোকৰ বিহেভিয়াৰেল ডেমেজ হয়। গতিকে চিভিয়াৰ ষ্ট্ৰেছ ইজ অলছ' এনাডাৰ ইম্পৰ্টেণ্ট সাইক'লজিকেল ফেক্টৰ আণ্ডাৰলাইং এবনৰ্মেল বিহেভিয়াৰ। Then there are some psychological models actually, and all these models also provide a psychological explanation of mental disorders. Now these models include the psychodynamic model, behavioral model, cognitive model, and humanistic existential models. Now the most oldest and famous psychological model is known as the psychodynamic model. Actually, psychodynamic approach, it was forwarded by uh, Sigmund Freud, who is known as the father of abnormal psychology. And psychodynamic uh, theorists like Carl Jung, Alfred Adler. So all these theorists believe that behavior, whether normal or abnormal, is determined by psychological forces within the person of which he or she is not consciously aware. Sigmund Freud actually unconscious mindৰ ওপৰত বেছিকৈ emphasize কৰিছিলে, and তেওঁ কৈছিলে যে internal conflicts are mainly responsible for the development of psychological illnesses, and people store so many actually things in the unconscious mind, and because of these conflicts they develop several kinds of psychological illnesses. So these internal forces are considered dynamic, such as they interact with one another and their integration gives shape to behavior, thoughts and emotions, and abnormal symptoms are viewed as the result of the conflicts between these forces. So this psychodynamic model was already it was formulated by Freud, and he believed that there different central forces actually that shape personality, and these are instinctual needs, drives and impulses, rational thinking and the moral standards. So Freud stated that abnormal behavior is a symbolic expression of unconscious mental conflicts that can be generally traced to early childhood or infancy. কিন্তু ফ্ৰয়ডৰ ফলোৱাৰ্ছবিলাকক যিবিলাকক নিউ ফ্ৰয়ডিয়ান সাইকোলজিষ্ট কোৱা হয়, তেওঁলোকে কিন্তু ফ্ৰয়ডতকৈ অলপ বেলেগ ধৰণে ইণ্টাৰপ্ৰিটেশ্যন দিছে। সিগমণ্ড ফ্ৰয়ডে একচুৱেলি আনকনচিয়াছ মাইণ্ডৰ ওপৰত বেছি এম্ফেচাইজ কৰিছিলে, ইডৰ ওপৰত বেছিকৈ এম্ফেচাইজ কৰিছে, কিন্তু তেওঁৰ ফলোৱাৰ্ছ নিউ ফ্ৰয়ডিয়ান সাইকোলজিষ্টবিলাকে ইগ'ৰ ওপৰত বেছি এম্ফেচাইজ কৰিছে, সেইকাৰণে তেওঁলোকৰ সাইকোলজিটোক ইগ' সাইকোলজি বুলি কোৱা হয়। বাট দিছ ইজ ট্ৰু ডেট psychodynamic model is the most famous and oldest model of the modern psychological models. The next model is known as the behavioral model, and behavioral model states that both normal and abnormal behaviors are learned, and psychological disorders are the result of learning maladaptive ways of behaving. Actually, if people learn some maladaptive behavior patterns in their lifespan development, then they may develop some kinds of maladaptive behaviors. Actually, people learn different things in their life, and the learning factors hence play a crucial role in the development of several kinds of psychological illnesses. Now, this model concentrates on behaviors that are learned through conditioning and proposes that what has been learned can be unlearned. So, learning can take place by classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and also by social learning. So, these three types of conditioning account for behavior, whether adaptive or maladaptive. Actually, our learning a learning principle kata influence kore. Sometimes we learn through classical conditioning actually, and sometimes it is possible through operant conditioning, and it is basically related to reinforcement part, and sometimes we learn through social learning. So maximum children actually learn different things in by imitating others actually, and their elderly people influence them in shaping their behavior pattern in many ways. গতিকে আমি যদি ভাল কথা শিকোঁ তেতিয়াহ'লে আমাৰ বিহেভিয়াৰ্ছবিলাক ডেফিনেটলি ভাল হ'ব বা এডাপ্টিভ হ'ব, আৰু যদি আমি মেল এডাপ্টিভ বিহেভিয়াৰ্ছবিলাক বেছিকৈ ফ'ল' কৰোঁ ডেফিনেটলি আমাৰ মেল এডাপ্টিভ বিহেভিয়াৰ্ছ ডেভেলপ হ'ব। চ' বিহেভিয়াৰ মডেলে সেইকাৰণে লাৰ্ণিং পেটাৰ্ণছৰ ওপৰত বেছিকৈ এম্ফেচাইজ কৰিছে। The next model is known as the cognitive model. Now, psychological factors are also emphasized by this cognitive model. This model states that abnormal functioning can result from cognitive problems. So, people may hold assumptions and attitudes about themselves that are irrational and inaccurate. So, people may also repeatedly think in illogical ways and make overgeneralizations. That is, they may draw broad negative conclusions on the basis of a single insignificant event. Actually, if our thought patterns are irrational, if we think in a very inaccurate ways, if our attitudes are negative, if we develop prejudices, if we always think in illogical ways, then definitely we will develop some kinds of maladaptive behavior patterns, because our thinking patterns are not logical, our thinking patterns are not rational. So because of these irrational thought patterns or irrational reasoning, we develop some kinds of maladaptive behavior patterns. that is stated by cognitive model. So our thoughts, our emotions, behaviors, if are irrational and illogical, then definitely they are responsible for some kinds of psychological problems. Then the next model is known as the humanistic existential model. So it focuses on broader aspect of human existence. So humanists believe that human beings are born with a natural tendency to be friendly, cooperative and constructive, and are driven to self-actualize. That is to fulfill their potential for goodness and growth. Actually humanist psychologists বিলাকে কি কৰে হিউম্যান বিঙৰ পজিটিভ একচুৱেলি এস্পেক্টৰ ওপৰত এম্ফাসাইজ কৰে হিউম্যান বিঙৰ গ্ৰোথৰ ওপৰত বেছিকৈ ষ্ট্ৰেছ দিয়ে গতিকে প্ৰত্যেকজন মানুহে হিউম্যানিষ্টিক সাইকোলজিষ্টৰ মতে কি কৰে মানে সদায় সেলফ একচুৱেলাইজেশ্যন নিড টু এচিভ কৰিবলৈ বিচাৰে বা প্ৰত্যেকজন মানুহৰে এটা নেচাৰেল টেণ্ডেঞ্চি থাকে বুলি কৈছে কোঅপাৰেটিভ বা ফ্ৰেণ্ডলি নিডছ এনেকুৱা ধৰণৰ কনষ্ট্ৰাক্টিভ ৱেত তেওঁলোকে কাম কৰিব বিচাৰে বা ভাল নিডছবিলাক তেওঁলোকে ডেভেলপ কৰিব বিচাৰে আৰু এইটো এটা ইনবৰ্ন টেণ্ডেঞ্চি বা নেচাৰেল টেণ্ডেঞ্চি বুলি হিউম্যানিষ্টছে বিলিভ কৰে So existentialists believe that from birth we have total freedom to give meaning to our existence or to avoid that responsibility. So আমি বাৰ্থৰ পৰা আমি একচুৱেলি সেইবিলাক আমি কি কৰি আহিছোঁ শিকি আহিছোঁ ফ্ৰম বাৰ্থ উই হেভ টোটেল ফ্ৰীডম আমি লাইফৰ মিনিং একচুৱেলি চবেই বুজি পাওঁ বা লাইফৰ মিনিং বিচাৰিবলৈ আমি ট্ৰাই কৰোঁ আৰু সদায় আমি পজিটিভ লাইনত কাম কৰিব বিচাৰোঁ কিন্তু চবেই আমি নিজৰ ৰেছপনচিবিলিটি ল'ব পাৰোঁ কিন্তু যিবিলাক মানুহে আচলতে নিজৰ লাইফৰ মিনিং বিচাৰি নাপায় তেওঁলোকে মানে সদায় কুৱেশ্যন ৰেইজ কৰে বা তেওঁলোকে নিজৰ ৰেছপনচিবিলিটি ল'ব নোৱাৰে সেইবিলাক মানুহে একচুৱেলি কি কৰে ডিছফাংচনেল লাইফ এটা কণ্টিনিউ কৰে আৰু সেইবিলাকৰ লাইফটো কেতিয়াও অথেণ্টিক নহয় চ' সেইটো কথা হিউমেনিষ্টিক এক্সিষ্টেঞ্চিয়েল মডেলে কৈছে Then next factor that is known as the sociocultural factors. So in addition to the biological and psychological factors, sociocultural factors also play important role in the development of psychological disorders. So sociocultural factors such as war and violence, group prejudice and discrimination, economic and employment problems, and rapid social change put stress on most of us and also lead to psychological problems in some individuals. Definitely war or violence manuhar monot kisman conflict ane anytime jodi violent activity manubilak activity মানুহবিলাকে দেখি থাকে সেই এক্টিভিটিবিলাকে মানুহৰ ব্ৰেইনত এফেক্ট কৰে বা মানুহৰ মেণ্টেল হেল্থত এফেক্ট কৰে গতিকে ৱাৰ ভায়োলেন্সৰ কাৰণে মানুহৰ সাইকোলজিক্যাল প্ৰবলেমছ হ'ব পাৰে গতিকে গ্ৰুপ প্ৰেজুডিছ আৰু ডিছক্ৰিমিনেশ্যনৰ মানুহক একচুৱেলি কি কৰে বহুত নিগেটিভ এটিটিউড ডেভেলপ কৰায় গতিকে যদি প্ৰেজুডিছেছ মানুহে এক্সপিৰিয়েঞ্চ কৰি থাকে বা ডিছক্ৰিমিনেটেড মানুহে ফিল কৰে সেইবিলাক মানুহৰ কিছুমান ধৰণৰ সাইকোলজিক্যাল ইলনেছেছ হ'ব পাৰে ইকনমিক এমপ্লয়মেণ্ট প্ৰবলেমটো এটা ডাঙৰ কজ হয় কাৰণ ইকনমিক প্ৰবলেম থাকিলে মানুহে নিজকে ভালকৈ মেনেজ কৰিব নোৱাৰে বহুত কথাত তেওঁলোকে এভইড কৰিব লগা হয় বা এমপ্লয়মেণ্ট প্ৰবলেমছ হ'লে একচুৱেলি নিজকে মেনেজ কৰিব নোৱাৰে নিজৰ ফেমিলিটোক ছাপৰ্ট দিব নোৱাৰে এনেকুৱা কাৰণত মানুহে ইভেন ছুইচাইডলৈকে কেতিয়াবা কৰে গতিকে বেলেগ বেলেগ ধৰণৰ সাইকোলজিক্যাল ইলনেছ ডেভেলপ হোৱাত ইকনমিক বা এমপ্লয়মেণ্ট প্ৰবলেমে কি কৰিছে এটা মেজৰ ৰোল প্লে কৰিছে আৰু ছ'চিয়েল চেঞ্জেছ যদি খুব ৰেপিডলি হয় তেতিয়াহ'লেও মানুহৰ কি হয় মেণ্টেল হেল্থত এফেক্ট কৰে চ' দিজ আৰ চাম ছ'চিঅ' কালচাৰেল ফেক্টৰ্ছ ৰেছপনচিবল ফৰ দ্য ডেভেলপমেণ্ট অফ সাইকোলজিক্যাল প্ৰবলেমছ Actually, according to the sociocultural model, abnormal behavior is best understood in light of the social and cultural forces that influence an individual. So as behavior is shaped by the societal forces, factors such as family structure and communication, societal conditions, societal levels also become more important. So it has been found that certain family systems are likely to produce abnormal functioning in individual members. Some families actually have an enmeshed structure in which the members are over involved in each other's activities, thoughts and feelings. গতিকে over involvement to actually ভাল নহয় এজনে আনজনৰ ওপৰত যদি জুখতকৈ বেছি ইনভলভ হ'ব বিচাৰে তেতিয়াহ'লেও ইণ্ডিভিজুৱেলজনৰ কি হয় এক্টিভিটি থট বা ফিলিংছত ডিষ্টাৰ্ব হ'ব পাৰে আৰু সেইবিলাকো মেণ্টেল হেল্থৰ কাৰণে এটা মানে প্ৰব্লেম হ'ব পাৰে চ' চিলড্ৰেনছ ফ্ৰম দিছ কাইণ্ড অফ ফেমিলি মে হেভ ডিফিকাল্ট ইন বিকামিং ইণ্ডিপেণ্ডেণ্ট ইন লাইফ গতিকে জোখতকৈ যদি বেছি প্ৰটেক্টেড ল'ৰা ছোৱালীয়ে ফিল কৰে তেতিয়াহ'লে ল'ৰা ছোৱালীবিলাকৰ ইণ্ডিপেণ্ডেণ্ট থিংকিং ডেভেলপ নহয় যিটোৰ কাৰণে তেওঁলোকৰ ছেল্ফ এষ্টিম বা ছেল্ফ কনচেপ্ট একদম প'ৰ হ'ব আৰু সেইটোৰ কাৰণে তেওঁলোকৰ ডিপেণ্ডেণ্ট পাৰ্চনেলিটি ডেভেলপ হ'ব আৰু সেইকাৰণে এনেকুৱা ফেমিলি ষ্ট্ৰাকচাৰবিলাকেও কেতিয়াবা ইণ্ডিভিজুৱেলৰ মেণ্টেল হেল্থত এফেক্ট কৰে চ' দ্য ব্ৰডাৰ ছ'চিয়েল নেটৱৰ্কছ ইন উইচ পিপল অপাৰেট ইনক্লুড দেয়াৰ ছ'চিয়েল এণ্ড প্ৰফেশ্যনেল ৰিলেশ্যনশ্বিপছ Studies have shown that people who are isolated and lack social support are likely to become more depressed and remain depressed longer than those who have good friendships. গতিকে ভাল ফ্ৰেণ্ডশ্বিপে মানুহক একচুৱেলি কি কৰে, হেল্ডি কৰে বা মেণ্টেল হেল্থটোত মানে পজিটিভ কৰে। কিন্তু যদি ফ্ৰেণ্ডশ্বিপ নাথাকে মানুহৰ বা ছ'চিয়েল ছাপোৰ্ট নাথাকে, তেতিয়াহ'লে মানুহৰ কি হয়, মেণ্টেল হেল্থটো একেবাৰে পুৱাৰ হোৱাৰ চান্স থাকে। So sociocultural theorists also believe that abnormal functioning is influenced by the societal labels and roles assigned to troubled people. So when people break the norms of their society, they are called deviant and mentally ill. Such labels tend to stick so that the person may be viewed as crazy and encouraged to act sick. The person gradually learns to accept and play the sick role and functions in a disturbed manner. Societal leveler karone asalote manuhe মেণ্টেল প্ৰব্লেমছ কিছুমান ডেভেলপ কৰিব পাৰে। ছ'চাইটিয়ে যদি এটা পাৰ্টিকুলাৰ বিহেভিয়াৰক ডেভিয়েণ্ট বিহেভিয়াৰ বুলি কয় বা মেণ্টেলি ইল বুলি কয় চ' ইণ্ডিভিজুৱেলক, তেতিয়াহ'লে সেই মানুহজনক ছ'চাইটিৰ বেলেগ মানুহে কি কৰিব, ইল পিপুল হিচাপে, মেণ্টেলি ইল হিচাপে একচেপ্ট কৰিব। বিকজ অফ দেট লেভেল অলছ' ছামটাইমছ পিপুল মে ডেভেলপ ছাম কাইণ্ডছ অফ সাইকোলজিকেল ইলনেছেছ। একচুৱেলি এইবিলাক পাৰচেপশ্যনৰ লগত ৰিলেটেড হৈ আছে। এখন পাৰ্টিকুলাৰ ছ'চাইটিয়ে এটা বিহেভিয়াৰক যদি নৰ্মেল বুলি কয়, সেই একেটা নৰ্মেল বিহেভিয়াৰকে বেলেগ এখন ছ'চাইটিয়ে এবনৰ্মেল বুলিও ক'ব পাৰে। ফেমিলি টু ফেমিলি অলছ' ইট ডিফাৰ্ছ। কিছুমান এগ্ৰেছিভ বিহেভিয়াৰক কিছুমান ছ'চাইটিৰ মানুহে একচেপ্ট কৰে নৰ্মেল বিহেভিয়াৰ হিচাপে, কিন্তু কিছুমান ছ'চাইটিত এগ্ৰেছিভ বিহেভিয়াৰক কি কৰে, একচেপ্ট নকৰে। চ' কিছুমান ফেমিলিত তেনেকৈ মানে জোৰকৈ কথা ক'লে বা ডাঙৰকৈ চিঞৰ মাৰি কথা ক'লে বা লাউড ভইচত কথা ক'লে নৰ্মেল বুলি একচেপ্ট কৰি লোৱা হয়, কিন্তু বেলেগ এটা ফেমিলিত এই পাৰ্টিকুলাৰ বিহেভিয়াৰটোক আকৌ নৰ্মেল বুলি একচেপ্ট কৰা নহয়। গতিকে এই মানে নৰ্মেল বা এবনৰ্মেল বিহেভিয়াৰবিলাকক একচুৱেলি ছ'চাইটিয়েও কি কৰে, মানে ইণ্টাৰপ্ৰেট কৰে বা ছ'চাইটিয়ে ডিফাইন কৰে। গতিকে ছ'চাইটিৰ লেভেলৰ ওপৰত বেছ কৰিও বিহেভিয়াৰবিলাকক নৰ্মেল বা এবনৰ্মেল বুলি কোৱা হয়। চ' আমি এই টপিকটোত দেখি পালোঁ যে there are several factors that are responsible for our abnormal behaviors. These are biological, psychological and social cultural factors play a crucial role in causing maladaptive behavior, either by producing faulty development or by increasing stress or both. So in addition to these models, one of the most widely accepted explanation of abnormal behavior has been provided by the Dietician stress model. So this model states that psychological disorders develop when a diathesis, that is biological predisposition to develop the disorder, is set off by a stressful situation. So this model is known as the Dietician stress model. So এই মডেলটোৱে কৈছে যদি biologically predisposed to develop that psychological disorder মানুহৰ থাকে, if the person is biologically predisposed to develop that disorder, then he or she may develop some kinds of psychological problems because he is biologically predisposed to develop that disorder. So this model has three components. So the first is the diathesis or the presence of some biological aberration which may be inherited. So biological abnormalities to মানুহে inherit কৰি আনে. So because of that biological abnormalities, people may develop maladaptive behavior. This is the first explanation, actually, first component. And the second component is that the diathesis may carry a vulnerability to develop a biological or the psychological disorder. So psychological disorder to logot actually ki hoy ase vulnerability to develop that disorder because he is biologically predisposed to develop that disorder. Ar he karone individual janor ei problem to hobo pare ba psychological disorder develop koribo pare. So this means that the person is at risk or predisposed to develop the disorder. So the third component is the presence of pathogenic stressors, that is factors or stresses that may lead to psychopathology. Because of some stressful situations or the stressors, people are actually developing some psychological illnesses. So all these stressors may lead to psychopathology. If such at risk persons are exposed to these stressors, their predisposition may actually evolve into a disorder. So this model has been applied to several disorders including anxiety, depression, schizophrenia and so on. Now, what is an example of diathesis stress model? More recently, the diathesis stress model has been used to explain why some individuals are more at risk for developing a disorder than others. For example, children who have a family history of depression are generally more vulnerable to developing a depressive disorder themselves. So dietician stress modeler upor ekarone modern psychologist basically emphasize korise because individuals are biologically predisposed to develop some kinds of disorder. Or bahut mental health problems are actually development a biological factor karone hoise ba biologically predisposed karone a problems like develop hoise boli researcher proof korise. Thank you.